The senator from Utah, Mr. Lee, proposes an amendment numbered 1331 to amendment numbered 891.
I ask unanimous consent for 2 minutes of debate, equally divided.
Without objection.
Welfare for the wealthy. That's what we have here. Expanding Obamacare and its premium tax credit without limit would allow families making up to $500,000 a year to access federal subsidies for health insurance. My amendment would limit this expansion so that no individual or family making more than 500% of the federal poverty line could receive them. For a family of 4, this cutoff would happen at around $132,000 a year. Any expansion of the Obamacare premium tax credit must be temporary and limited. Look, regardless of how you feel about Obamacare, regardless of how you feel about this expansion of it, I think we should all be able to agree that allowing those who are making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to access this form of government assistance, even in a pandemic, perhaps especially in a pandemic, is inappropriate.
President.
The senator for Oregon.
I rise in opposition. Colleagues, this is what this amendment would do. It would deny premium assistance to many middle-class families, forcing them to pay more for health care, the last thing they need in the middle of a pandemic. Now, in 2020, the average cost of health insurance was $17,244 for a family of 4. That is a hefty bill to pay without assistance for most middle-income families, especially those who live in higher-cost areas. ACA premium tax credits can mean the difference between affordable health insurance and doing without coverage. I urge colleagues to oppose the Lee amendment.
I call for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, no. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, no. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, aye. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, no. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, aye. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, no. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, no. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Haggerty. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, no. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, no. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King? No. Mr. King, no. Ms. Klobuchar? Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Langford? Mr. Leahy? Mr. Leahy, no. Mr. Lee? Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Lujan? Mr. Lujan, no. Ms. Lummis? Mr. Manchin? Mr. Manchin, no. Mr. Markey? Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Marshall? Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. McConnell? Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Menendez? Mr. Menendez, no. Mr. Merkley? Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Moran? Ms. Murkowski? Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy, no. Mrs. Murray? Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Ossoff? Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Padilla? Mr. Padilla, no. Mr. Paul? Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters, no. Mr. Portman? Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Risch? Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Romney? Mr. Romney, aye. Ms. Rosen? Ms. Rosen, no. Mr. Rounds? Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Rubio? Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Sanders? Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Sass? Mr. Sass, aye. Mr. Schatz? Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Schumer? Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Scott of Florida? Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina? Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mrs. Shaheen? Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Shelby? Mr. Shelby, aye. Ms. Sinema? Ms. Sinema, no. Ms. Smith? Ms. Smith, no. Ms. Stabenow? Ms. Stabenow, no. Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Tester? Mr. Tester, no. Mr. Thune? Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Tillis? Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Toomey? Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Tuberville? Mr. Tuberville, aye. Mr. Van Hollen? Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Warner? Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Warnock? Mr. Warnock, no. Ms. Warren? Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Whitehouse? Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Wicker? Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Wyden? Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Young? Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Kennedy? Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Cornyn? Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Crapo? Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Langford? Mr. Langford, aye. Ms. Lummis? Ms. Lummis, aye.
Are there any senators wishing to vote or change his or her vote? If not, the yeas are 49, the nays are 50. The amendment is not agreed to. The senator from Iowa.
Thank you. I call up my amendment number 902 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report the amendment by number.
The senator from Iowa, Mr. Grassley, proposes an amendment number